the greatest compliment that you can get as a filmmaker is that people felt all of those things and they physically manifested in the real world, because I think audiences now are so tapped in intellectually to the world. Everything has to be categorized, everything has to be labeled, and so even when you're watching a movie, everyone is thinking of it from a very distant lens where they can control the experience and label it and basically write the review in their head while they're watching it. And we wanted to create a movie that just smashed through the intellect, that cage that we've built around our brains, so that we can just feel things that we can't put into words. I think one thing that we all are feeling in life, everyone who exists right now, is this overwhelming, chaotic nature of having to juggle your personal life, work life, the internet, wars that are happening in other countries, politics that are happening, climate change, this overwhelming feeling of just narratives smashing into each other. And we felt like, no one is using the multiverse in a way that is actually philosophically just like staring at the chaos and staring at infinity, and we thought this would be a wonderful chance for us to do that, but in a way that also played with conventions. We wanted to break every convention possible, and the multiverse gave us a lot of opportunity for that. When we first started, we knew we wanted to create something that somehow bridged the gap between big blockbuster action films and really intimate, risk-taking indie films. And we wanted to find a way to do both at the same time, to carve out space for independent films in theaters. So we knew we wanted to make it really entertaining, but also we wanted to kind of give ourselves a challenge of creating a multiverse film that actually went all the way to its logical, terrifying conclusion, and yet still pulled you back from the brink of meaninglessness.
What is the truth?
Nothing matters.
First thing that comes to mind is the disconnect between the fact that we have these infinite imaginations as humans. Our brains are just built to constantly be calculating and processing different narratives in our heads. And yet we are trapped in these very limited bodies, and how frustrating that is as a living person who has to move around in one physical space, knowing that this is all we get. And I think that tension is probably something that has frustrated us, ever since we, first.
Since our brains, became the way they are.
Exactly. That tension has only accelerated because of the internet, because now not only do we have our own imaginations to contend with, we have the imaginations of everyone else on the internet.
The internet has created so many moral bubbles and different centers of universes, and what's happening now is we're watching them collide, and we're all kind of terrified to see what's going to happen next.
As we wrote it, we had this idea of a villain, Jobu Tupaki, and we were trying to kind of crack what's her problem and what's her voice, and started to kind of reflect on millennials and Gen Z kids and what it's been like to grow up on the internet when your parents didn't, and how that generation gap is very specific. The internet informed so much of kind of her character, that sense of humor and kind of those themes, and we didn't have to point the camera at a phone.
The universe is so much bigger than you realize.
We talked about what character would be the most interesting one to put through the ringer, and the more we talked, the more we got excited about being someone who's older, someone who's maybe our parents' generation, who's had more life lived, so maybe more regrets. And then we started talking about our parents and started talking about the immigrant experience, because Dan's parents immigrated, and that was like even more interesting, like even more kind of color to like the past lives, the alternate lives they could have led.
We didn't know we were going to accidentally tell an immigrant story. That was never the intention right at the beginning. We just wanted to make a fun action movie. But what ends up happening often when you're writing is you start to put yourself into the project, and you start chasing what is most interesting. And usually what is most interesting is the stuff that you are close to. And one of the really interesting unexpected synergies between an immigrant story and a multiverse story is that they actually have a really interesting overlap in that they're both about the question, what if? And they're both about looking back and looking at the other possibilities. And that's always, like, I think anyone with an immigrant parent, or who actually is an immigrant, can relate to that feeling of wondering what your life could have been if you had stayed, wondering what it would have been like if you moved somewhere else, if you had married someone else, if your kid had grown up in a different town. There's so many questions that can be explored in the multiverse in a way that we didn't expect. And so all of that just came together so beautifully and became a beautiful vessel for our very personal stories. For a long time, I was like self-conscious of the fact that, like, I didn't believe that our story was worth putting on the screen, because I didn't think people would want to watch it. And this experience is showing me just how important it is, not just for the Asian American community, but just for everyone. I've been reflecting a lot about the fact that everyone is kind of pointing to the question of generational trauma and generational love that our film is trying to tackle. And just talking to people, I'm realizing how important it is for all of us to be showing these very small stories as universal. For instance, with the generational trauma thing, I'm realizing now as a new parent that the act of our generation kind of breaking the cycle of generational trauma can feel so small, and yet it probably is the hardest thing any of us will ever do, and maybe potentially the most important thing any of us will ever do, because whatever we pass down to our next generation is going to affect the way that they deal with all of the hardship and conflict and turmoil that's going to be coming at them within the next 50 years. We're at a point where, to me, I'm realizing the question of generational trauma and whether or not we break the cycle is going to be the difference between, like, survival of the human race, potentially. Because if we don't raise children who are emotionally intelligent, who can see each other, who can communicate with each other through all of this noise, who aren't hung up by the traumas of their past, and instead are able to look forward and look forward towards the possibilities, then I don't know I don't know how well we're going to fare as a species in the next 100 years. So, like, to me, I'm like, this is so important, and yet it's the smallest thing that I was so ashamed of, or not ashamed of, but it's the smallest thing that I felt like no one would care about. And now that I've put out this movie, I want to, like, take every filmmaker friend that I know and just, like, shake them and be like, that small thing is so important, and you don't know why yet, but you should chase it, because someone's going to need to hear it, someone's going to need to see it, and maybe it'll become so universal that it, like, literally changes the conversation around how we talk about it.
In a chaotic world that is constantly pulling your attention towards all these other different things, it becomes impossible to just look at the people you love and to actually see eye to eye with them, and how that accidentally hurts people. And it's not because any of these people are bad people, it's just because they don't have the time to fully look at each other and say, you're a human being with who contains multitudes. Yeah. And so then once we set that up, the rest of the film is just kind of trying to dismantle that and be like, and basically try to show the audience and also our main character how important it is to just take a moment and look at someone and say, I can see you completely, I can connect with you completely, because maybe that's the only way we're going to survive the chaos, is if we just allow ourselves that time every now and then.
No matter what, I still want to be here with you. I will always want to be here with you.
We needed to convince ourselves that even if we are just one tiny speck in a sea of infinite other versions of ourselves, that there's something still worth holding on to in this moment.